Arcadians have long had a fondness for midsummer. They reckon it goes right back to our Neolithic ancestors, those early settlers who built their stone monuments to perfectly align with the sun on the solstice. Thousands of years ago, men would gather in the ancient burial tomb of Maes Howe to watch as the sun peaked perfectly above the Hoy Hills and in through their hollowed chambers. Today, folk will gather for a game of midnight golf instead. To me, midsummer always calls to mind a thing called the simmer dim. You'll only know it if you live far enough north. The Orkney Islands sit at a latitude of 59. During the winter months, we're lucky if we get 7 hours of daylight. In the summer, it's the other way around. The simmer dim is our name for that time when the sun finally dwindles on the horizon but never quite disappears, when the dusty twilight lingers and the seabirds chatter on the shore like wind chimes in the distance, when it's neither night nor day. Every year, without fail, our father would wake us up in the early hours of the solstice to take the flatty, his boat, out round the shores. He'd make up a different excuse every time. "Come on, lads, there's herring to hook. There's been orca spotted round the skerries. Up!" I used to hate the feel of his rope-worn hands on my shoulders as he shook my body awake, the plume of malt which followed him around. I'd think of my pals sleeping soundly in their beds. What I'd give to have an extra 6 hours kip instead of being frog-marched, bleary-eyed, down to the slip. "It's character building," Father would insist as I glowered at the brown muck of seaweed which stood between ourselves and the shoreline, a trail which led to an annual destruction of my best-loved Reeboks. Callum would play along with the pleeping and gurning too, but only when Father was out of earshot. Truth is, he didn't really mean it. He loved taking the boat out as much as the old man himself. It was the only time we felt like opposites, Callum and I. I'd never been the seafaring type. My nautical skills fell disappointingly flat, despite the summer lessons I'd been lumbered into attending at the nav school. While the eager sea pups would turn their hands to the basics of steering and knot tying, my pals and I would set off on our own agenda, and were more likely to be found smoking under the old lifeboat pier than practising our berthing skills. Callum took to it, though. He and the old man would often be out round the bay together, or be found touching up the flatty's paintwork on a rare shorts and t-shirt sort of day. The only time we ever came out here, the three of us, was on the solstice. As a lad, I was sure that Father had designed these early morning trips to punish me for my ineptitude. He and Callum would be sharing stories in the stern, while I'd be doing the dog's work of rowing in the bow, trying my best to ignore the lurching feeling in my guts below. "Dinna look behind you," Father would call intermittently. "You'll steer yourself off course." The mechanics of steering always had me in a guddle, going backwards to go forwards, left to go right, always minding to avoid the look of contempt in my captain's eyes. It was only as I got older that I began to understand that there was a reason he took us out here, not just in the simmerdim, but on the solstice in particular. It revolved around our mother. Father never mentioned her name. Maybe in the Legion, after a few, but never in our house. Not since 94. But Callum, he'd talk about her. He'd tell me how she had the longest hair of any wifey in the town. It came tumbling right down to her bum, but she'd often wear it up, so you'd never know. He told me about the ganses she used to wear, how the colours blurred into one, and the wool used to scratch his face when she pulled him in close, but he never really minded. He'd tell me how the house was gey full of laughter and music, especially after the New Year bells, when the fiddle would come out. Mother would sing something in Gaelic, and no matter how many folk were there, a hush would fall over the room, like bairns listening to a lullaby. Callum told me why the solstice was important, that Father had once been a romantic man, and had taken our mother out on the flatty so she could see the colours of the simmerdim fae the sea. They'd rowed further than was safe, near to the brink of where the tides meet at the Hoy Sound. If the currents had been against them, they could have been swept into the open waters of the North Atlantic. Instead, they witnessed something strange. The water began to glow. Thousands of wee lights twinkled around them. Blue, green, silver, azure fireworks breaking across the surface, ignited with every stroke of the oar. There was no explanation for it. Just like there was no denying something cosmic had taken place. Father said it was like watching the Northern Lights, the merry dancers, cut across the ocean. Mother called it the Stars of the Sound. That was the night my father asked her to marry him. Sometimes I worried that I was forgetting our mother. I could remember things she had said, but not the tone of her voice. I couldn't remember the length of her hair or how her ganses felt. I'd wake up, clutching at the air in front of me, falling through a tailspin as I cried for her to come back to me. It was on these nights that Callum would stay up with me deep into the morn. He'd build walls around the edge of his bed and tell me to climb into his makeshift boat. He'd gather every light he could find, torches, candles, sometimes even picking the glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling, and together we'd try and imagine that night in the boat. Some nights we'd be getting chased by electric eels shooting up from the depths below. Others would be rowing through an ocean of enchanted marbles which began to glow as the flatty drew near. Always the sky stayed wonderfully bright and colourful, as though an artist was watching from above and splashing watercolours around us in great fat brushstrokes. The night would grow quiet and safe again as I listened to Callum describe what her parents had seen. He was old enough to remember Father's account. In whispered tones, he told me how every midsummer our folks would head out into the simmerdim to find the Stars of the Sound again, sometimes leaving us tucked up in our beds. Every year they returned without luck. "It didna stop him looking," Callum would say, with a playful glint in his eye. "Why do you think he drags us out there still?" I'd always wondered if it was the sense of tradition that my father liked, that these trips were more about clockwork and routine. Callum argued that it was more. Watching the way our old man searched the waves, the way his body pricked with hope if a shard of sunlight splintered across the water, the glum silence which filled the boat as we rowed home, fruitless, I began to wonder if Callum was right. Father had never struck me as an imaginative man. Yet whatever his reasons, whatever he had seen that night, it was clear that he felt it was connected to the solstice. Who knows? Maybe he wasn't far off the mark. Years later, as a student, I shared a grubby Aberdeen flat with a lad who majored in marine biology. His ears pricked up when he heard I was fae the Northern Isles, and we soon got to talking about the weird and wonderful creatures you can find in the waters around Orkney. I asked him for his take on the stars. "Bioluminescence," was his reply. It was a chemical reaction which could occur when the sunlight, combined with the swirling currents, could cause the algae in the water to glow like fireflies. He explained that it was quite common in warmer climates, but strange to hear of in Scotland. Not impossible on the longest day of the year, though, when the sunlight was at its peak. It wasn't too hard to imagine, he felt, that my parents could have rowed right into a swarm of the readily charged beasties. So there was an answer, and if there was an answer, the story could well have been true. And if the story were true, then it could happen again. I can remember the feeling of excitement which coursed through me as I crossed the Pentland Firth, returning home that first summer. I was excited to tell Callum what I'd learned. His eyes locked with mine across the rim of the pint glass. I searched them for the familiar green shade, so similar to my own that folk would often comment upon our likeness as bairns. Now they seemed as grey as the flagstones that had led us here, darkened by rain, trodden and worn with time. He'd taken to drinking more that year, becoming more and more like the old man. He brought the glass down on the table with a dull thud. "Well, that's it then," he spat. "Mystery solved. There's nothing out there but sea and sound and science." The alliteration wasn't lost on me. Each word cut like the swish of a sword. I could feel the warm blush of blood spreading across my cheeks, the hurt tears of a 4-year-old threatening to show. Callum necked the last of his pint before leaning in for one last stab. "Face it," came the words. "That man spent 12 years searching for something which didn't exist. If you want to do the same, go for it. But count me out." And with that, he was gone. I stared at the empty space across from me, like a lost child on a stoop. It reminded me of a night 4 years before. The night I'd told my father and brother that I planned to leave Orkney after school and would be applying to university. A strange shame had filled the room, and they sharply made their excuses. Our trips out into the solstice had come to an abrupt end that year. My decision to leave, it seemed, had made me a man. Whatever follies we'd shared as children were set to drift with the currents. The changes rolled with the waves. Father stayed up increasingly late, watching telly and smoking plump cigarettes. Callum started work on a creel boat and moved into a flat above the baker's. He'd spend several weeks at sea, and his days in between seemed to disappear into a drunken har. There had been trouble with the police too, though I never quite got the full story. It wasn't spoken of, just like Mother wasn't. Staring at the empty glass in front of me, I thought of all the words that had never been spoken in our house, and what might have been said if the straps had ever come loose. That our father was a broken man, that he'd spent half a lifetime chasing a moment he could never get back, that there were no stars in the ocean and no magic to be found, and no way to reconcile the pain that came with her leaving. But we were men, and these things went unsaid. That was the last conversation my brother and I shared before I returned to uni, one of few over the years to come. My student days passed in a haze, the recollections of what I'd learned somewhat tinged by the taste of cheap rosé, the sullen headaches which followed, and the bitter regret of girlfriends who came and went, pals who came and went, family who went. A degree certificate emerged, only to find its home in the back of a wardrobe somewhere. A job was secured, and along with it an unrequited wish to abandon it all and head for some distant land with sunnier climes. My thoughts of home were fleeting, but they did come. Sometimes Orkney would pop up on the news, usually if an important discovery had been made at one of the archaeological digs. I often wondered about those ancient communities, whose lives and behaviours revolved around the sun. Scores of archaeologists have studied their monuments, Maze Howe, the Ring of Brodgar, the Stennis Stones, all asking the same question. What does it all mean? The question would ebb and flow in my mind for some time to come. Of course, I thought of the islands every year as the solstice rolled by, but I never returned during my student days. Folk south barely acknowledged midsummer. To them, it's just another day and another year gone by. And then came that phone call, in the early hours of the 25th of June, 2018. 2 years have passed since I returned home. My accent hasn't quite found its way back, and folk here will often give me a sideways glance when they pick up on the Doric twangs I must have gathered in my absence. It seems that despite only being away 5, maybe 6 years, that's enough time to have earned the local accolade of a ferry louper. I suppose it was a sacrifice I was willing to make. The inquisitive looks have never bothered me. It's the other look which unsettles it all. Ken the one where folk will search your eyes to weed out your pain? The empathetic, apologetic, uncomfortable one. The knowing look. Don't get me wrong. The folk of Stromness have gone out of their way to welcome me back. They've been kind in ways I could never have imagined, and in ways I'm sure never to forget. But it's hard to walk those old cobbled streets knowing that you'll face that look time and time again. The blethers you'll have with folk and the questions they'll skirt around, but that you wish so desperately they'd just ask or forget. Sometimes I find myself heading in the opposite direction for the town. There's a particular place at the Ness shore. I find myself coming here more and more, particularly in the morning, before the dog walkers emerge and before the bairns take to plittering in the rock pools below. My cottage is close enough that my coffee is just about warm still. Sometimes I just sit and listen to the morning sounds, the high-pitched pips of the oyster catchers, the overhead squabbling of the herring gulls, the continuous comfort of the waves tumbling over rocks. In front of me lie the shallow skerries, where a colony of seals alternate their time between sunbathing on the rocks and edging noisily towards the shore. Beyond the rocks, the view extends to the islands of Gramsay and Hoy. Between them flow the criss-crossing waters of the Hoy Sound. They never found his body. Callum. An oar eventually washed up on the Bay of Stairs at the near side of Hoy. But it was never really enough to tell us the truth of what happened that night. There was the formal inquest, of course. We listened as locals explained what little they knew. That Callum had been in the bar that night, that there had been talk of taking the flatty out, that he hadn't shown to work the next week. He'd essentially just disappeared into the night. Only it couldn't really be called night at all. He had gone into the simmer-dim and had never come home. It takes 7 years for a missing person to legally be declared dead. As far as father is concerned, that gives us 5 more to prove otherwise. I can't imagine a day'll come when he'll ever stop looking. I made my peace with it on the 1st anniversary. Perhaps I couldn't take the barren searches, or worse still, the fear that we might actually find him. Perhaps I felt that one of us had to be realistic. Perhaps I just wanted to look after the old man and to talk him down from blaming himself to the end of his days. I often wonder whether folk think me heartless for coming to terms with it all, but the truth is, I haven't, and I doubt I ever really will. There's a certain calmness, though, that comes with the thought of Callum rowing out to the Sound in the heart of the solstice. Folk will inevitably continue to ask what was going through his mind. Most probably assume that he knew the danger in front of him and that he wanted to end his troubles there and then. Maybe it's daft, but I've always felt that I knew what he was looking for, and that deep down, maybe I was glad he went looking for it in the end. I've never said that out loud, mind. Some things are best kept to yourself. Scholars will no doubt continue to visit these islands as the centuries wind on. They'll continue trying to answer the questions of our ancestors, how they lived, what they believed, why they left their markings as they did. Over time, I've come to believe that not everything needs an explanation. The only constants in this world lie here in front of me. Sea, land, life, death. Anything beyond that is swept into a tide of mystery and wonder, and those are the things that can make you feel the most wild and free. I like to think that this was the final bond my brother and I were meant to share. I hope he did find that magic again. Maybe one day I will too. Ken a funny thing? Folk often describe the Simmerdim as eerie, that it's unnatural to be caught in the twilight, neither in night nor in day. Out here, with the endless sea stretching before me, I quite like the in-between.